Thank you, Jacob. It's great to be here on Hop In. It's a real honor for me, especially to be able to present to the Andrews Center Women in Leadership Conference. I am a board member of the Andrews Center for Public Policy, and this is a great annual event. So I hope you're all enjoying it and that you'll gain a lot of information and that you'll come back again next year. And so without further ado, I'll go to my first of the top 10 legal tips for small business. So the first thing to think about if you're either currently operating a small business or if you're making some plans to do so is what kind of a legal form or legal entity do you have? So listed there on the slide is sole proprietorship, LLC, which is a limited liability company or a corporation. So really people in my firm and people in our business law practice area really have told me that they recommend everybody to have an entity because there's a lot of really good effects from that. And you'll see some of them listed there. It may protect you and other people that are owning the business or operating it from personal liability, and it will allow for clear management and financial decisions. So let me just elaborate just a little bit on these topics. So I'm going to focus more on the limited liability. Oh, could you go back one slide? Sorry. I have my very wonderful assistant here, Kim Kane. I'll give her a big shout out, and she's controlling the PowerPoint for me, so I can just talk to you without worrying. So the limited liability corporation it provides for some flexible governance, flexible distribution of the profits. Now, in order to form this, each state is going to have its own particular laws about this, but they tend to be pretty common around the United States. But I notice we have some wonderful people here, obviously from Idaho, but then we have attendees from various other states. I see people are from Wyoming and Pennsylvania, so very excited to have people from outside the state. So check your own state's laws on this. Obviously, since I'm an attorney, I would always love to advocate that you all would have an attorney that you consult with. Sometimes some of the local law schools in your areas would have things like small business clinics. There are also some wonderful resources through maybe your state's Department of Commerce or from the Small Business Administration. So always try to seek out some expertise. Having said that, though, if you can check your own state's laws yourselves, these are readily available on the internet. Now, for an LLC, you need governing documents, and that's going to be a certificate of organization and an operating agreement. So two basic documents, and you can get these started pretty quickly. You might ask yourself, what happens once the LLC is formed? How is it run? In other words, you're the business owner and you want to run it, right? So you can have an LLC that is yourself. You're the only member of the LLC. So let's say you have, you're an artist, you have a business where you make handmade paper. Like here in Boise, Idaho, we have something called Letterpress, which is an artistic shop where they make stationery and that sort of thing. So you call yourself Letterpress Inc. It might be, or Letterpress LLC, it's probably maybe just Joan Smith is hypothetically the owner. So that's okay. You don't have to have more than one owner. The LLC gives you that flexibility. But the operating agreement has to indicate who is a member and who is a manager. So some LLCs are member managed. So again, we could have Joan Smith as the managing member. That's fine. Some LLCs then might designate a manager. And so you just want to specify these things in these documents. And each state, as I said, they'll have some forms that you can take advantage of. Now, other important things about the LLC. you have to have a written operating agreement. So just forming it is not enough. You have to form it and then have the operating agreement. In other words, how is it going to be run? Operating means you're running it. So you have to be very clear in that operating agreement about the duties of each of the members, and if there's a manager, a specific manager designated. So just in general, in most areas, duties are going to include the very important area of fiduciary duties. A fiduciary is someone who owes a higher level of responsibility to either a person or an entity. So in this case, they owe that higher responsibility to the LLC. So there are two basic duties, a duty of loyalty and a duty of care. So the duty of loyalty basically pertains to conflicts of interest. So the loyalty of the member or the manager is going to be to the LLC over and above their own self-interest, their own personal interest. So conflicts of interest, in other words, say there's a business deal that comes to our hypothetical company of letterpress. But one of the members there says, and maybe there's more than one member. Let's say it's Joan Smith and Ray Smith. And Ray says, I think I'd like to do that deal just for myself. Well, he's a member and he has to get the permission and the consent of the other members before he can do that. Duty of care basically means not to be negligent, grossly negligent, or reckless, or in fact, not to intentionally violate the law or intentionally harm someone. So any act like that, as you might imagine, would greatly harm the LLC because the act of that member or manager could be attributed to the LLC. So just a final couple of tips. When you're in an LLC, major decisions about it have to be agreed to according to how it is mapped out. So one of the things in the operating agreement that will be specified is who makes these decisions. Sorry, we're getting an incoming phone call. This is part of the excitement of being on camera. So I apologize. So what are some of the decisions that would require member approval? That would be if we're selling all of this LLC's assets, or most of them. If we're making big financial commitments, say we're taking out a loan to expand the business, so something above a certain amount of dollars. People might want to specify $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, whatever it might be, according to the scale of your own business. Hiring decisions, I'll get into that in more depth a little bit later, but that's very important. If there is litigation that we're about to engage in, or if we've been sued, if we're making loans to any of the managers or members, that's, that starts to get into that idea of conflict of interest. So that would require all kinds of approvals. If you're leasing real property, that's a topic I touch on later. Again, very significant business decision. As I've already mentioned, a conflict of interest transaction would have to be approved. And then the annual budget for the company, that is something that also would be approved by the members. Now, I mentioned earlier that it's very important to have an entity. So you can have an LLC, which has become, I would say, more popular recently because the laws in various states have become more concrete. Corporations, again, are also very, very important in this arena. That can be an S Corp, which is good for a relatively small business. But one of the things that having this entity does for our business owner is to protect them from direct personal liability in many instances. It's called maintaining the shield. It's a liability shield that this entity gives you. So you always want to identify this entity as the entity that is signing any documents. You want to have a bank account for the entity. You want to keep separate books and accounts for the entity and not mingle it with your personal accounts. You want to follow all corporate formalities. So you have regular meetings. You pass resolutions as either the members of the LLC or as the board of the corporation. So things like this, if there is ever any lawsuit against this company, if the company doesn't have a lot of assets, people suing might try to reach the personal assets of the members or of the shareholders. So maintaining these corporate formalities will help try to resist against reaching your own personal assets. So with that, Jacob, nice to see you on screen. I wish I could see all of you on screen, but I think for the hundreds that are attending this conference, that would be a bit challenging. So if we have any questions, I would take those now, or otherwise I will go ahead with item number 2.
Far, we haven't received anything up, but we'll give it a moment. Maybe some folks are still writing some things up now that you've finished.
Okay.
If not, we'll just move to the next one, but I'll just keep an eye out on the chat real quick.
Okay, and I can go back to different topics. So please, whenever you have a question, please post them to the chat as Jacob has mentioned. So now we'll go on to item number 2.
It looks like we do have 2 questions here from that topic.
Okay.
Okay. What kinds of resolutions would we need to pass? And then,
okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. What kinds of resolutions would we need to pass? Well, you would want to have resolutions like, for example, who is allowed to sign checks for the organization, right? You want to have probably an annual meeting at which you pass a resolution naming the members. These people are still members. So a lot of these resolutions are for some of the basic structure of the corporation.
There was a second question too, just to clarify, how does one do all of this? So what's the process? Where do they start?
I think a good place to start if you are starting a business would be with the local small business administration. And for example, here in Boise, Idaho, we do have a women's business center. So specifically for women who are looking to start businesses, that would be also a very good place to go.
Great. Are members different than employees?
Yes, members are different. That's all these are great questions. Thank you. Members are owners. So members have, and I'll get to this in just a second. It's part of slide 2, but employees potentially can become members, but they usually do not start out having an ownership interest. Now, of course, members can also be working. So in my hypothetical about Joan Smith, she's an artist. She's working in her own business. She's a member of the LLC, but she's not an employee. She is really an owner. Now, she may take on a part-time Boise State art student who needs to learn things and needs a little extra money to pay expenses. That person is an employee.
And there's one last question too. If you have multiple LLCs, would you need to have an annual meeting for each one? For example, even if we have properties that are held in an individual LLC?
That is a very good question. Often people will incorporate different real estate holdings into individual LLCs. So say it's a husband and wife perhaps owning a different piece of real estate. Say you have 5 different pieces of them. So yes, each one is an individual LLC, and the Secretary of State of your state is going to request compliance from you. Now, the meeting need not take a long time. It need not necessarily be physical. It could be over the phone, or it could just be in writing. So it doesn't have to take a lot of time, but to keep up this excellent form of entity that helps to protect you from liability, it is definitely worth your time. But if you have 5 different ones, they would require 5 different compliances in essence. Yes. Great. Okay. I think I'll go on just so I can make sure I complete the whole presentation, but keep posting and we'll hopefully get to all your questions. So the next sub tip here is laws regarding the interests of other owners, partners, and investors. And this kind of relates to one of the last questions, which is So the members or the shareholders, they are the owners of this entity. And they have laws that protect their interests. So we hope that this is a profit-making enterprise. And again, I am addressing for-profit entities here. I am not addressing nonprofit corporations. So that would be a whole other part of the law. So the corporation ownership is going to follow the stock percentage that's owned according to the articles of incorporation, the bylaws, and the shareholder agreement. And the LLCs will be similar, but they're not corporations, so they don't really have shareholders. They really have members. You can also go into a partnership. Now, typically for a small business, that's probably not the best thing. But for example, I am an attorney. The attorneys here at Hawley Troxell who own and operate the business are partners. And so you have a partnership agreement. And the distribution of partnership profits is done, again, according to that partnership agreement. Any of these terms are going to affect the dissolution or winding up strategies. I will get into a small section on how do we end this business. More of the focus of this presentation today is how do we get it started up? How do we operate it? But there is that important step of the end point. Just a couple of other tips on this. How do we raise money? I know, Boise, Idaho really does have a great reputation as kind of a startup city. We have Trailhead, which is a wonderful, I should have mentioned them. Trailhead is a wonderful resource for companies that are starting out in the tech sector. But how do we raise money? So one way to do it is bank loans. See if a bank will be willing to give you a reasonable loan. I did read an article recently in a financial journal that, we are in a recession, but interest rates are low. So, starting a business in a recession might seem counterintuitive, but on the other hand, some of the expenses might be lower, and that would include the expense of capital. Private equity is another way. We've all heard about these different private equity funds that are in Silicon Valley and other places. There's some in Idaho, there's some in Utah. I'm sure they're in various parts of the United States. Those private equity companies will typically have their own types of agreement that they want you, like let's say you're this artist person and you have this very valuable design, they probably want you to sign their type of agreement. So if you're getting into that level where you're getting some venture capital or private equity money, really good to really examine those agreements very carefully, because those people that are investing are going to really want to have a lot of say in your business, try to control that business. And there are trade-offs. All of that equity that's coming in may really help you expand. But again, you're giving up some of that control that you have as a smaller business. Another source of capital for you, of course, are savings that you yourself have. Let's say you have a current job and you're a full-time employee, but you've been wanting to start your own business. You may have some savings. Or family and friends can often be investors. They can often offer loans, or they could become part owners by taking the risk with you to invest in your new business. So I would ask if there's any questions now, which if you want to post those. And I'm going to go right ahead into slide 3, which is I think this is a very current topic, certainly, is intellectual property. We all hear about this all the time. I will be one of the first people to confess that I am not an intellectual property lawyer, but I have gained enough experience over the years and some information from other lawyers in my firm. I can share with you probably what I would call a 3,000-foot level of IP. So you might say to yourself, well, I don't think my business would have intellectual property. Well, I can tell you that, for example, a number of years ago, I was litigating an agricultural case, and it involved the recipe for dehydrated potatoes. So it was a secret recipe by this company, and they alleged that somebody else had stolen it. So recipes for food or types of processes, there's a lot of different things that can be protected. So you need to kind of inventory or identify what is your intellectual property and make sure that you own that intellectual property. Another example is software programs, people writing these programs. This can be intellectual property. So patents will protect certain types of inventions and other unique things that you develop. You want to choose very strong brands or trademarks and register those. I give you in my slides some websites that you can go to. You can also copyright. So you can, for example, let's say it's this little letterpress that we have here. It's quite a nice business. I've seen them at various, like Art in the Park, all kinds of other things. You might want, if you have a certain specific design, you might want to copyright that so that nobody else basically appropriates it from you. And you have to register your copyright because you have to have that registration before you can enforce a copyright in court. Then the last step, and I'll give you a little bit more detail on this, the last step is to monitor and enforce all of these forms of IP. So what is a patent? A patent is a monopoly that's been created by our US law on new inventions. So these are sanctioned by law. So you can follow our legal system in that. A copyright is a property right in creative and tangible works. So it can be, a book, an article, a piece of music. I mean, it's just all kinds of different things. And then trademarks. So I've been using that letterpress as an example. So the term letterpress or letterpress of Boise, Idaho, that could be a trademarked term. Maybe they don't want me using that in this presentation. Maybe Jacob, I hope I'm not violating anything here at our Andrews Center. So again, letterpress I'm using them as a hypothetical example. Trade secrets, I think I mentioned that formula for those dehydrated potatoes. So you can have trade secrets as well. So I guess I did mention to you earlier that you've got some good public resources when you're trying to get your LLC or your corporation formed. We do have the U.S. Patent Office, the trademark and copyright people. So we have some very good governmental entities here. One other thing I would mention, and I'll mention it a little bit later, is you may have, for example, a key employee. Let's say that employee is developing intellectual property for you. So you want to make sure you have an agreement with that employee. Typically, if employees are developing things for the business that employs them, that intellectual property should be covered by an agreement. Who owns that intellectual property? I think the same is true at universities and at most businesses. So you want to make sure that it's clear, because that person may leave the company and may try to take some of that intellectual property with them. So you can register these things with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. I talked about monitoring. There are ways to monitor and enforce this. I think we have had some local companies here in Boise, Idaho, that help do that. I think so we've had some good development of new businesses in that regard. You can set Google alerts and see if somebody's using the name of your business or your trademark property. There's all kinds of different registrations you can get. I think there's an Amazon brand registry. So make sure if you are developing products, or any intellectual property, make sure that you yourself are personally keeping up with who out there might be attempting to appropriate that. So I'm sure there's a lot of questions on intellectual property, but
yeah, we do have a few questions. The first one is, first of all, am I able to share your slides in the chat for them? We've got a couple of folks who are asking to have a copy of the slides.
Oh, sure. Yes.
Perfect. I can go ahead and share that. And then the second question is, Is U.S. patent first to create or first to file?
I think it's first to create, but don't wait to file. So don't quote me on this. Brad Frazier is our intellectual property lawyer, and I'm going to tell you to email him. Right.
Yep.
Perfect. And then the second one is also, don't patents expire or have to be renewed?
I think it's a lengthy period, though. Yes. But yeah, you want to stay on top of that. You want to know when you need to renew. And because if it's expired, and they do expire, like we see that happening, I think, particularly in the drug company arena, where they do get patents for a while. And it seems like in those periods of time, the new drug is a very expensive product. And then after a while, that does expire. So you have to stay on top of that.
Right. Can you talk about the difference between members owning IP versus licensing to the company for use?
Yeah, I think you can license to the company. Yes, I'm sorry, the question was about licensing. Yes, IP can be licensed to another user. That is correct, yes.
Perfect. Where can I be sure the recipe is not already protected by another entity?
Yeah, and that you could probably kind of do that in reverse. Contact your US offices and take check on the name and see if it's been registered. So you can kind of do it in reverse to see if that registration is available.
Great. That's all we have for this section.
Great. Well, it's a very complicated topic, and I'm definitely gonna refer you to one of our great resources here at the firm. And the end of my slides give you all the names of some of these people, and so you'll be able to find them. So, okay. So my next slide relates to your specific business and what laws and regulations, including licenses, might be applicable to your business sector. So these regulations can be at the federal, state, and or local level. So a simple, example of this in Boise, Idaho, which I'm glad to say that we do have this, is that we do have licensure here for daycare. And as a very engaged parent and now grandparent, I was always glad raising kids, now helping with grandkids here in Boise. Very glad that we do have these regulations. That might not be true in every area. So if you're starting a business, take a look at that. Now, I checked with our Idaho Division of Occupational and Professional Licenses, and there is a huge laundry list of various industries, everything from acupuncture all the way down the alphabetical list of the fact that you need a license. Cosmetology is one obvious example. Now, there are professional licenses, each of whom has their own board. And again, this is probably true in most states. It certainly is true in Idaho. So you would have engineers, architects, attorneys, physicians, nurses, but then there's a plethora, just a huge laundry list of other occupations that require licensure. So if you're starting one of these businesses, you want to make sure that, if you're going to be operating, let's say you're a cosmetologist and you're going to be providing those services, that you have that licensure, and that people that are also providing those services for your business have the same licensure. And you have to keep tabs on, whether they are fully compliant. Now, at our law firm, we have 75 attorneys around the state of Idaho, and we have an office in Reno also. And I know that our firm keeps very close tabs on our licensures. They help us make sure that we re-register every year. That's typical with most licensures. There's typically a re-licensure every year, if you will. Usually involves paying a fee. Sometimes there's a continuing education element that's required. Also, depending on what type of product that you are selling. I mentioned, of course, pharmacies. Of course, there you're selling things that have been licensed probably by the FDA, and some are controlled substances. So say you're starting a pharmacy and you're going to want to comply with all those regulations. Perhaps there would be other types of products that also require that type of compliance. So again, a good place to start in any of this research would be looking at your specific state. You can contact the Small Business Administration, which is at the federal level. You can contact your state Department of Commerce. So there are all kinds of resources out there, but make sure you're in compliance with that, because typically there is going to be penalties or fines, things like that, if you are found not to be in compliance. Any questions there? I don't see any for the moment, so I'm just going to go right ahead with slide number 5, which you want to, so when you go into business, or, I think some of you are already in business, you want to make sure that you have the right types of contracts for your dealings with customers, suppliers, and other third parties. So third parties would be people that are not owners or members of your LLC, or shareholders, or so outsiders. And I'll get to the employee issues in just a moment. So you might be buying equipment. You might buy the raw material to produce a product. Let's say you could be a candy store, let's say. So you're buying all kinds of raw materials there. You need supplies for your business. Even though we're supposed to be paperless, I think my law firm absorbs quite a bit of paper each year. Cleaning services, so you might have a contract with an outside cleaning organization, that sort of thing. You will probably have some contracts if you are selling your product or services in bulk, say to a middleman that is then distributing them to the end consumer. That will definitely require a contract. You might have contracts with your employees, and you also might be leasing your building and equipment, in which case you'll have leases. Those are also contracts. So, in the state of Idaho, and I don't know that this is true in every state in the United States, but in the state of Idaho, oral contracts are enforceable, but there are lots of exceptions to that rule where written contracts are required. So if you have a sale of goods for over $500, you have to have that in writing. Now that can be, as simple as a bill of sale, but it has to be in writing. And recall that I had said earlier, it's important to keep up that entity, that, make sure that all of your contracts are signed in the entity's name. So it's Letterpress LLC, it's whatever you have named your business. And that when you sign that, you don't sign in your own individual name. You have a line that says signing as member or manager of the LLC, because that's going to protect you. Just a couple of other things too. One of the things that I have seen in my own practice, where I've represented businesses in litigation, is uncertainty about the termination clauses in these agreements. So you want to make sure that you have a termination provision. So sometimes termination provisions can be at the convenience of either party. Sometimes the termination provisions are after a definite term. Let's say you've guaranteed to sell all of the coffee that you roast to 5 different coffee shops, and you're going to do that for a period of 5 years. And at the end of that, there's an automatic termination unless the parties agree to go ahead for an additional term. Sometimes there's also termination for cause. So if there's a good cause, that could be specified. So I will never forget, I had a contract where I was representing a governmental entity years ago when I worked as an assistant U.S. attorney. And that contract had been signed for the demolition of some buildings because my client, the governmental entity, had plans to build a big facility on what had been residential ground. So naturally, things take a long time, but by the time they were ready to get started with this demolition, my client, the governmental entity, had decided they didn't want to build that facility anymore, and therefore they did not need to pay for the demolition of something that was going to remain standing. However, there was not a very good termination clause in that agreement. There should have been a termination for a change of plans where maybe there would have been a penalty of some kind. But my poor governmental entity got sued. We lost in court. I hate to confess losing any case, but I did. So you want to have a very clear termination provision to protect your business, and it just makes for better relationships between you and the customer, whoever you're serving, because you know definitively how long that contract is going to last for and what is going to give rise to the end of the contract. Any questions about that at this point? Okay, we are good. So now the next topic I want to cover with you in my top 10 tips, we're halfway through, is employment law compliance. So your business is at the stage where it can't just be you operating the business. You are too busy marketing and getting loans and taking care of your shareholders, et cetera. So you need an employee, or perhaps even more than one. Idaho, and I think many states are like this, but again, check your own state's laws depending on where you live. Idaho is an at-will state, meaning that employees can be terminated for any reason or no reason. Typically, employees in the state don't have contracts, but of course there are exceptions to that. As I mentioned earlier, any employee that is creating intellectual property for your business should have a contract that transfers the rights to that intellectual property to your company, unless you have some other good reason for making an arrangement where the employee perhaps gets a certain percentage or something like that. Another overall point, and again, there's a lot of reference sources for this on the Idaho Department of Labor website, probably similar websites in other states. Become familiar with the laws that apply to your business regarding discrimination, harassment, workers' compensation, and unemployment insurance. And I'll also add to that the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is overtime. You want to have a written non-compete and non-disclosure agreement for key employees that are probably working with your customers, or that are perhaps having proprietary information of the business. They might have customer lists, access to other very private information. So you don't necessarily need to give that employee a term of employment, but they need to agree to having the non-compete and non-disclosure. And it's usually a good thing to enter into that contract at the same time that they are being hired. Sometimes if that comes up later, and then there's a violation later on, that can be a defense that there was no reason for them to enter into it since they'd already been hired. Then my final point on this slide, before I make some elaboration on all of this, is this person an independent contractor or employee? This is a very, very topical discussion right now, especially as it relates to some people in the so-called gig economy. So let's talk about this for a minute, about the employees and the independent contractors. So if you do get into an agreement with your employees, you want to set out what their pay rate is. You want to set out that non-compete and non-disclosure, or you might also call that a confidentiality agreement. And again, if they're signing away all their rights to the IP, or if they are retaining some interest, That has to be made very clear. Again, if there is a written contract, typically the employee is going to stay as an at-will employee. Sometimes people want to have a term of employment, like if it's a very key employee, you want to try to have them stay for a certain period of time. So sometimes there might be a term like a 2 years, 5 years, might be typical. On the independent contractor agreement, there you will want to define that they are independent, they're providing a certain service, that your business is the recipient of those services. There's some very complicated aspects to how you define them, but you definitely want to disclaim that there's an employment relationship, that they are not the employee, you are not the employer. I also mentioned other laws that may apply to your business. Now, you've probably all heard about Title VII. Various states also have their own anti-discrimination laws. Title VII on the federal level only applies to businesses that have 15 or more employees. So if your establishment is quite small, that law will not typically apply. Although I think as a person, typically, you're going to want to have good policies in your business, because inclusion, diversity are highly valued. And so obviously, even though the law might not be applied, there are good reasons for diversity and inclusion and promoting best practices. The Americans with Disabilities Act likewise can apply in terms of reasonable accommodations. Again, that's only for 15 or more employees. The Age Discrimination in Employment Act applies to protect any employee at the age of 40 or beyond. And again, that applies to businesses with a larger workforce that is 20 and above. The FMLA, which is the Family and Medical Leave Act, applies to businesses of 50 and above. The Idaho Human Rights Act, which in Idaho is similar to Title VII, which protects people on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, and age, that does pertain to smaller businesses. So that pertains to businesses that have employees numbered 5 and up. And the Affordable Care Act provisions apply to businesses with 50 employees and more. And the Fair Labor Standards Act applies generally to any business that is 1 employee or more. And that pertains to paying overtime wages. Just another couple minutes on overtime wages. So there are exceptions to that, but typically for overtime over 40 hours a week, that requires 1.5 times the pay rate for that employee. There are exceptions for highly paid workers, executives, managers, administrators, other professionals. There's a lot of governmental enforcement in this arena, and the penalties are quite high. It can be double or triple damages, going back 3 years at least. So you want to make sure that you're really complying with that. And as I said, typically the Department of Labor is going to have very good information for you. I see we have a chat. Jacob, I'm going to pick that up. That was the Idaho, that's from Wendy. That is the Idaho Human Rights Commission Act, Human Rights Act. The Human Rights Commission, again, has a very useful website. So that is for 5 employees or more. And that prevents discrimination based upon those protected classes that I mentioned. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, if not, we'll go ahead to my next slide. The next slide pertains to insurance. So you want to make sure that you are, well, remember how I talked about having the entity to protect you against liability. Other ways to protect your business and yourself personally is through insurance. And, frankly, if you have a loan from a bank, they probably want you to carry the correct type of insurance. So we have the type of insurance that's called general liability coverage. This protects the property owner and any tenants and your lender from claims resulting from accidents on the property. So this is for businesses that have a physical location. My previous example of the letterpress, if they had a physical location, potential customers might go in there. It could be, any kind of personal injury that could happen. Our own law firm here does a fair amount of slip and fall defense for a very large retailer. And, if there's a reason why a customer can trip or fall, the reasons can be numerous, right? So you can have rugs, you can have slippery patches on the floor, who knows. So you want to have that type of coverage. You also want to have property insurance. Right now we are seeing terrible disasters, both from the Western fires. We see this from the hurricanes that we've had. And, when you see the images, your heart just breaks for these individuals. Now, most of the images that I think we're seeing are of individual residences and their, people and cars. But for a business, if you, like, say you have this beautiful art that you're selling, but then all of a sudden your sprinkler system goes awry some night and the sprinklers go off and destroy, $50,000 worth of inventory, you want to make sure that you have some kind of coverage that will protect you. Now, one of the things I think we all know is that insurance policies often come with exclusions. So this is true in any of these types of coverage. So one of my colleagues here in the firm, who is very familiar with issues of insurance, gave me a tip to pass on to you, which is to get the correct endorsements for your type of business. So in other words, make sure you have a good insurance broker. Make sure that broker really understands your premises and your business, how you operate, what types of inventory you keep, really goes into it with you in depth so that they know what type of coverage is going to suit you the best. Then another point too is that you may have the type of business where you have employees that are driving. They may drive to the post office for you. They may drive to pick up supplies. They may drive to visit a customer. Say you're in an interior design business and you have an employee, or even you yourself, you're driving somewhere and you get into an accident and you're driving on business. So you want to make sure that any company vehicle is insured for this. You want to make sure that the employees themselves, if they're driving their own personal car, they may not have enough coverage on that vehicle. So a heads up on any of those types of activities. And now I talked about exclusions. So typical exclusions it's going to cover, a listing of insurance exclusions covers quite a bit. So it covers things like war and terrorism, that's excluded. Earthquakes can be excluded. I'm probably in some parts of California, you can get some coverage. But here in Idaho, we've had a number of earthquakes over the last few months. I've often said to my friends and my husband, what next? So hopefully we're done with these earthquakes, but that's excluded. Mold, another issue, excluded. Mudslides, sewer backups, floods, but typically sprinklers are not covered. So my example earlier probably was covered. But again, you've got to know what your exclusions are. Fraud and dishonest acts by your employees are typically excluded. Foundations settling, that sort of thing. So So you just make sure when you are purchasing coverage, you really know what is in the policy. So in property damage, just to summarize, you have basic and named perils and then special perils. You want to make sure you're covered for certain basic perils and then specially named perils. But again, just a caveat, there's nothing that I would call like all risk coverage in property insurance. It's just, the insurance industry is just not there where they're going to cover all risk, and the same for liability. I know a hot topic lately in the pandemic has been whether or not, business interruption insurance is covered by does the pandemic, can that be covered? And I don't think we have any definitive statements yet from any very high courts, but I think there's been traffic that I've seen on various listservs where we're thinking it's probably not covered. But there may, again, you have to look at your own policy and talk to your own broker. Questions on this topic?
The first question, how do you differentiate between time versus who gets overtime? Is there a law that separates the two?
Yeah, the comp time really should only be applied to those higher level employees. So you want to look to see there's both a functionality and an earnings test. So you want to keep up to date with what those tests are. But typically for a lower, like let's just say a sales clerk, somebody who is earning an hourly wage, somebody who is not a professional in your office, they're at your direction, they're working hourly. That type of a person is going to require overtime. Comp time will not pay them for that work.
The next question is, what type of insurance coverage does an LLC need if it's an online consultancy, no brick and mortar offices?
Yeah, so you don't have that type of premises or product, but you could be subject to claims, for example, that you have defamed someone. So you want to get an umbrella liability coverage. You want to cover against liability. And there again, consult your broker. You're going to tell that broker all the details of your business. Let's say you're an online consultancy and you're writing articles for an industry publication or something like that. You want to tell them all the ins and outs of that business, but you definitely want to have some kind of coverage. You may have personal coverage. I think a lot of people do, like through your homeowner's insurance. There's usually an umbrella coverage of some type, but that may not be enough. So you want to really double check that, because the last thing that you want is to have somebody sue you. And don't I sound like an attorney? I mean, I have to confess, I am an attorney. Attorneys, basically, I think we grow up always seeing all the 5 or 20 terrible things that can happen. I don't mean to be negative. I'm not trying to be negative, but I want you to protect yourselves. So double check, if you have a big umbrella policy through your homeowner's insurance that covers all risk, maybe that's enough. But I would definitely talk to the broker, especially if it's something new that you're just entering into. But yeah, internet businesses have exposure. They have risk. They may not have floods or fires or sprinklers ruining product, but there is definitely still risk.
Great. And the last one is, do you have to cover independent contractors under your insurance?
Well, that's an excellent question. And I'm going to talk more about independent contractors. No, I already did. I'm sorry. I'm getting a little bit behind. Independent contractors, typically they should have their own insurance. So, I want to tell you there's like a 26-part test from the government on what is an independent contractor. So you have to think of an independent contractor as like, this is like a separate business. You don't control them, but when they're out there maybe doing a service for you, you want to make sure that they are adequately insured. Are they adequately insured? You don't have to carry the coverage for them, but if they can't assure you that they have the right coverage, you need to get a different contractor.
That's all we've got for this section.
Okay. So Jacob, we're like 3 minutes. I have 3 more slides.
And you have all the way until 3:30. We've still got, yeah.
Oh, good. Phew, I was getting worried. Okay, thank you. Thanks, folks. Sorry. And Jacob, you're going to share all the slides with the audience,
Put the
right?
link to the on the chat.
Awesome. Okay. So let's talk about taxes for a minute. So, very exciting topic, which I think we all dread, myself included. So as a business, you're responsible now for more than just your own personal taxes. I'll tell you a story from practice that I had where, when you're representing the government, you get to be on both sides. I told you that my governmental entity was sued. Now I'm going to tell you that I sued people on behalf of the IRS. So you're going to be thinking, we liked her before, but, I can tell you one of the suits that I had to file was against a business. They had employees. They were a relatively small business. They had a number of employees, but they were not a gigantic, corporation. They were a small business, but they had run into hard times. Their cash flow was bad and, they were in debt. So they ran into hard times. So what they did was they did not remit the withholding taxes to the government. They kept that in their own coffers and they used it as part of their operating capital. Of course, the IRS found out about this and I ended up suing them in federal court. It was a civil suit, but it carries heavy penalties. They had to pay all the back taxes plus penalties and interest. So things like this you don't want to get in that situation. So when you're a business, you're going to probably pay taxes if you're a profitable business. Again, you want to make sure that you have your business structured such that, you can't get away from paying taxes, but it's going to structure it for you so that, you're not being hit with excessive taxes either. So for example, you may want to keep capital in the business and not distribute the capital. So certain structures can help you do that. Like I mentioned, the S Corp, the LLC. What about sales taxes? Sales taxes are, in the state of Idaho, 6%. I think it's a little higher if you're in one of our resort communities. So you have to collect those if you're selling a product. There's other sales taxes. There's exemptions from sales tax. I think that's been one of the kind of hot political buttons in our state is, do we have too many exemptions? So you want to see, am I subject to one of those exemptions? Am I not subject to sales tax? For example, certain services, law firms, for example, do not charge sales tax on their services. So there's a number of exemptions or exceptions to that. So you want to check that. I guess I'm going to wrap up my quick presentation on taxes just by encouraging you, when you're first getting started out, get good systems set up so that you're keeping current, you're remitting these things when you need to. A good accounting firm will help you with that. And again, there are public resources. The Idaho State Tax Commission has an excellent website. That would be a good place for you to start. If you have an accountant, which is probably, advisable, talk to that person they will help you too. But don't get behind on these things, because these taxing entities want to be paid promptly when these taxes are due. And don't get into that problem like that small business that my IRS client had to sue, and we won. So now I've told you a story about losing a case and winning a case. So I feel like I'm equal now. So that's good. Okay. Let's go on to the next issue, which is leases. So this applies to both businesses that have a physical presence, and then I will touch on the internet for those of you that are in, a consulting business or some other type of business that doesn't have a physical location. And that, businesses like that can also have a product. I know a woman who does very nicely on the internet. She sells textiles and she ships them, but doesn't have a store. So there's lots of different options out there, especially, with the internet. So leasing a premises. Now, I'm not going to talk about purchasing. That of course is an option, if you want to purchase a business premises. But I think typically a lot of times, especially when you're first starting out your business, you may just want to lease a space, maybe expand later as your business gets more profitable. Purchasing might become an option for you. So I'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but you want to have a start and an end date. Remember my earlier comments about the termination. You want to have that end date. You don't want to be leasing this space for too long of a term. Who covers the expenses? You or the landlord? Who's in charge of maintenance? You or the landlord? Who is in charge of repairing and replacing? What are your liabilities for damage? What if you start a fire? What if you're a negligent? Do you always have to cover things? Or, even if you're negligent, is the landlord covering that? And the same might be true. What if the landlord is negligent? Let's say they haven't maintained the wiring in the building for 25 years and all of a sudden something sparks and, your inventory is destroyed. So really, when you're looking at the lease, you're looking at an allocation of risk. Where is the risk between you and the landlord? And we earlier talked about insurance. Of course, insurance can help mitigate some of this risk also. And typically, you're going to want to talk through the insurance issues, I would think, with your landlord. You can have an internet business. You don't have to have a physical location. It just depends on what kind of a business you have. Just as a little side plug, I will give a side plug to the Boise Art Museum's Art in the Park Marketplace. This is going on right now. And for those of you in Boise or even elsewhere, what you're seeing there is a virtual marketplace of about 100 artists. If we were not in the pandemic, they would have come together in Julia Davis Park. We would have had booths. We would have seen the merchandise. We would have talked to the artists, and we would have hopefully made lots of purchases, because it's a big fundraiser for the Boise Art Museum and also for the artists. But just like me appearing before you on camera, wishing I could see you, just like me, we are doing this virtually this year. And all of these businesses, all of these artists had internet presences. They were selling their wares online already. And they've all joined together under the auspices of the museum to sell their goods to people who access that marketplace. So the internet is a powerful tool for businesses. I don't know how. Now that I'm shopping, virtually a lot of the time, I think to myself, what did I do before, the big A company started? I don't know. So here we are. So the internet business issue, you want to register that domain name that supports your brand. And you want to get the social media and internet, which would be SEO, search engine optimization, real estate, as soon as you can. Speaking of Amazon, which I was afraid to actually mention their name, but they, they were thinking of a different name. I just read an article about this, and it would have started with a C. They thought this Amazon was so magical that they thought of abracadabra, and they were thinking of cadabra. So, but they didn't go with that because somebody advised them that it sounded like too weird of a word. Just didn't sound right. And they wanted to have A, so they chose Amazon. But I guess the South American countries that actually have the Amazon River running through it, were not too keen on that. But, of course, what Amazon, of course, goes out and it registers the domain name. You want to register anything close to it. So you'll do that, and you'll come up with a name. Maybe don't offend people, obviously, with the name. Make it something that's recognizably your own. Okay, so just a couple of other points, especially on these brick and mortar leases. These can be very complex. The lease typically is going to last a while, because the move in is expensive, the move out is expensive. You're going to probably have you or the landlord make some improvements. And it creates many duties between you and the landlord. You, as the tenant, you want to operate your business successfully in this space. And the landlord wants to define what are the costs that they are going to incur, what is their liability, what control do they have over the premises, even though you're there. And they want to make sure that you have the financial wherewithal to actually enter into this lease. So in Idaho, I think this is true in most states, a lease longer than 1 year is governed by the statute of frauds. So it has to be in writing. I think, again, in Idaho, some contracts that are oral can be enforced. So, for example, if you talk to a landlord and you say, I want to come into your space for 6 months, and you're in Idaho, that is probably enforceable. It may not be enforceable in other states. But if you want to go in for a year, you have to have that in writing. And I had a case years ago where a huge claim was based upon an oral contract, and it was not for a lease. It was a different kind of contract. So after that experience, fortunately, my client was able to settle the case on very good terms. So I'll say that was a victory for my client. So I'm 2-1. But I just want to say that please, please, please do things in writing. It can be simple, but again, start date, end date, who has responsibilities. In terms of your lease, make sure that you have a description of the property. What exactly are you leasing? Are you leasing 1 floor in a building, half a floor? Have that very clearly laid out. Remember, of course, sign in the name of your entity. Do not sign yourself. Now, one thing I will mention is that they may require a personal guarantee from you. So let's say you just set up your LLC. The LLC has no assets, but you want to enter into a 3-year lease. That landlord may ask for your personal guarantee. You may have to show that you have the wherewithal to be able to pay for that lease. And this, I'll mention that this can be true in any number of situations. In any of those other contractual situations I mentioned, you may be asked for a personal guarantee. You want to make sure that you know what your rights are as a tenant. Do you have rights to parking? Probably not. I think parking is expensive anywhere, certainly in downtown Boise. Is there a common area like a lobby? Do they provide trash service? Do you get relocation rights if they want to somehow kick you out? Do they have to pay you some kind of termination penalty? So I would say if you're entering into a lease there, you can find leasing agents that will operate on behalf of the tenant. They will want a fee. But if you're going to lease a fairly large amount of space for any period of time, this may be a good idea for your business. Okay. Are there questions about that? Oh, I see.
Yep. Do domain names have to be renewed, or can they expire like copyright?
I think you want to check that and make sure that you're not giving up this valuable asset. So contact my colleague, Brad Frazier. This is great. Brad's going to get a lot of calls. But yes, you want to look, you know how I think I've had a refrain of what is the start date, what is the end date. So when you're registering, take a look at that. If it doesn't give you an end date, you know, check on it every year. Just calendar. Okay, I'm going to check on my domain name, January 1st, you know, whatever day you like, you know, just make sure. And again, it's like any of that intellectual property. Is somebody else using this? You know, set those Google alerts. Make sure that you are monitoring this name, because the name is valuable to you. Oh, I see. They do expire. Thank you, Wendy. I love this. This is great. Okay, Brad gets one less call. It's okay. Okay, so my last point to you is, now that you have this great business up and running, you know, are you going to do this like until you are ready to retire, or are you going to sell it? What are you going to do with this business? And this is not an unrealistic proposition. You know, transition, succession planning is a very real issue for smaller businesses, family-owned businesses. So you want to look at this really when you first get started. So your governing documents, those initial documents that you put into place, can't give you a roadmap for how are you going to vote on this issue. So let's say you have an LLC with 2 members, and it's 2 business people in business together in the LLC, and one is ready to wrap up, one wants to go and, you know, retire to Arizona, have, you know, nice time playing golf, hiking, whatever they want to do. And the other one wants to stay in business. The other one is, you know, gung-ho. You can spell out in your documents, is there a right there? Does that remaining member, can that member have a right of first refusal? That member could have the right to buy out the other member. And there could be a formula for, how do we value this business? How do we know what that remaining member should pay to the departing member? Sometimes you could have a fixed duration of the business. You might say, let's go into this business together for 10 years. And at the end of 10 years, we're just making a plan that we're going to dissolve the business. You could have a plan to sell the business. I will give you a hint, though, on selling the business. You want to be very careful. There are business brokers out there, and I think they do a great job. You want to make sure that a potential purchaser of that business signs a very well-documented non-disclosure and confidentiality agreement, because in looking at your business, that potential buyer probably wants to look at your books and records, wants to visit your premises, wants to look at any inventory, wants to interview your employees, they want to do all kinds of due diligence for themselves in that business before they would purchase the business. However, you're really revealing lots of very important information that you've built up over the period of time you've run a successful business. So be very, very careful at this end period, because I think sometimes, people make the decision that they want to go out of business. It's probably maybe a difficult decision to make, and they rush it a little bit, so really, really plan this out and make sure that you have all the necessary documentation to protect yourself in the event of any potential theft by that would-be purchaser of your valuable, say, customer list or recipes or any other intellectual property that you have, or your business assets. So it is something to plan for. However, creditors will usually have to be paid first before let's say you just dissolve or wind up the business. So you're going to pay those creditors off, make sure any applicable taxes are paid. What are the obligations? Is the lease still in effect? Are you able to sublease? What's happening with your inventory? So there's a lot of detail that has to be gone through, but obviously businesses do transition. We have companies that are very, very old, but they've all gone through transition. This could be a time when the company gets taken over by its investors, if it has investors. So there's many, many good ways to exit gracefully with the money in your bank account that you have worked so hard for. And so I hope that you will each think about starting your own business. Women are the entrepreneurs of the United States. Many, many women-owned businesses get started every year. And so we should be proud of women's entrepreneurial spirit. And with that, I'll take any further questions. Jacob?
So I don't think we have any new ones yet, but feel free to send those through the chat and I can help facilitate that.
Yes, and here's my thank you slide. So that Brad Frazier that I mentioned he's one of our IP lawyers and very graciously helped me put this presentation together. And so I know that he would be gracious with
Great.
his
It looks like there was one
expertise.
question that I missed. What determines mandatory overtime?
That's a very good question. So you first have to think about, is there a category of person, right? So again, we're not talking about that highly paid or managerial person. So mandatory overtime is where you as the employer are directing that employee. And so let's say, let's take those artists of that marketplace, and I placed an order. And the artist has employees. He or she has one or two employees who are doing nothing but wrapping packages and putting them in the U.S. Postal Service and intending for them to get to the customer, which in my case has already happened twice, and I have 2 more orders outstanding. So keep my fingers crossed. So if you tell that employee works 8 to 5 with 1 hour lunch break, and you're at the end of the work week, that employee has already put in their 40 hours of work that week, right? But you say to that employee, I am directing you that you have to stay an extra half hour to complete wrapping these packages and sending them off. And that employee is under your direction and control. That's what it means to be an employee. They're not self-directed at work. They follow the direction of their manager, which is you, the owner of the business, right? So that's mandatory overtime. That's required of that employee. Now, if you said to them, well, you've reached your 40 hours, you can clock out, you're done. And just wrap this package next week. You have to make sure, though, that the employee does not do that in that extra 10, 15, 20 minutes. There has been major litigation about things like that just take a few extra minutes, at the end of that work week. And people have recovered money based on that practice. So you really kind of have to look at this very strictly. So if you're telling them they have to do it, you have to pay them the time and a half. If you make it optional, that really still isn't going to cover you if they're over the 40 hours. So you have to be really careful about it.
What is an advantage / rules of LLC versus sole proprietorship?
So in the sole proprietorship, that's you. That is, you have no entity that stands between you and liability. And it also, it means that you're paying taxes of this business as your own personal income. You're not paying it as business taxes. There's different tax rates. So, the corporate income tax rate is 21%. It goes higher than that for individuals. I don't think that we would recommend maintaining any business just as a sole proprietorship. I think it is done, but it doesn't give you the advantages that you should have from either the LLC or the corporate structure.
And the next question is there any additional legal risk outside of registration domain to consider as we shift from brick and mortar to click and mortar from a new business perspective?
Yeah, well, I think one of the issues there is probably what I was just referencing earlier is managing that workforce. So and a lot of us are working remotely these days. I happen to be physically in my office today, but a lot of us are. I was working remotely before, and so were many of my colleagues. And I think we'll just do so again. We try to keep our physical headcount down here in the law firm because of the risks of COVID-19. But I think risks generally from click and mortar would have to do with how are you managing that workforce? The workforce is not physically present with you. You may have one or two employees outside of your physical presence, which perhaps gives you less control over them. Like on this issue of wage hour, you would want to institute something where that they're logging off. So they are doing work for you on a 40-hour-a-week work basis. But what happens if they log back on and they spend an extra 10 minutes, responding to a customer's email that comes to them in the 41st hour, right? Again, we see litigation on all these fronts that pertain to employees. You would want to make sure that even that you have that liability insurance, because when things are being done on email, on Twitter, whatever social media, I cannot tell you how many times in recent litigation that I've seen where text messages are excavated from years ago that show an allegation of harassment or something like that. So what happens, I think, at click and mortar is that record is being generated on a continuing minute by minute basis, and it never goes away. It's there's no in a litigation over, let's say, maybe harassment, or, as I said, third party litigation maybe by a customer over a defective product. So you really have to be careful with your record keeping and make sure that you instruct your employees, in the proper use of email, other forms of electronic communication, and guard against that third party liability too, in terms of making derogatory comments about a competitor's product, things like that. So I think the nice thing about internet-based businesses is that I think the entry into it is less expensive. The idea of having a physical location and renting space, as I mentioned, leases are complex. You can have people slip and fall in your premises, all kinds of things. But so internet-based businesses are easier to enter, but not risk-free. They just bring another set of risks that's based upon that communication medium, and the fact that, I think unless you impose strict controls over your workforce, you don't have as much controls. You really have to have to figure out protocols and, what's appropriate to put in an email, what's appropriate in a text message on business time and business matters, And so again, not risk-free, but certainly a great way to get started and to have a good
The next question we have is, I have been considering law school as a mid-career change. I'm fascinated with IP law, yet every lawyer I have had a chance to talk to tells me not to do it. Do you like being a lawyer? Would you recommend taking the patent bar instead? And is there a demand for patent agents?
That's a great question. Yes, I really do enjoy being a lawyer. I've had a very varied career myself. I was a judge and also in legal education. So, and philanthropy. I mean, I've really been able to leverage my law degree to have a very expansive and exciting career. And I do think that the law empowers people, to make their ambitions come true. So, yes, I would say the best thing to do is to pick the law school that you want to attend, or pick a couple of law schools in your region, and contact their admission office. And those admission offices are there for you. They're there to help you and figure out, is this the right path? Because it does take, it takes a lot of investment in terms of your time, your money, your energy. I mean, it's a grueling program, but worth it, I think. I know I myself got a different graduate degree before going to law school. And while I was in that graduate program, I got to take some law courses, and I thought, oh, this is for me. So I ended up with 2 graduate degrees. So maybe it's better to just go straight to law school. As far as the patent agency, double check, maybe go to the USPTO, or you could also email the dear Brad Frazier. I think to be a patent lawyer, you have to have an undergraduate degree in a STEM subject. I think it has to be science, technology, engineering, and math, I think. But so you can't just decide. Now, if you want to do that, you can maybe go back to school and get a different undergraduate major, but there's a lot of hurdles. A patent agent doesn't have to be a lawyer, though. So if you have that scientific background, you can become an agent without becoming a lawyer. I don't necessarily think I would recommend that, because if you're going to go through all that trouble, you might as well be able to practice law. But again, talk to USPTO, Patent and Trademark Organization. You can talk to Brad. You can talk to those admissions counselors. They too know about those subjects of the patent bar.
Well, I think we've hit the very end of this session. For those of you who haven't already filled out the Skill Builder evaluation form, I have pinned it at the top of the chat. Go ahead and fill out that form for us so we know what we did great, what we can do better for next time, how you enjoyed the Skill Builder, and we'll let Cathy wrap up this little session here.
Well, I want to thank everybody that attended. I know it's a little bit dense. You're definitely getting Small Business Formation 101 in like an hour and a half, which is nowhere near enough, but I hope it's provoked some good ideas for you and ways that you can start a successful business and really, look to the future and be confident about your abilities. And I want to thank Jacob. You've been a great moderator. I have enjoyed working with you very, very much. And I want to pay tribute to Kim Kane, my dear colleague here at the firm. And yes, Kim, yay. So with that, I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the conference, and I'm going to attend other parts of the conference myself, and maybe I'll see you on the chat. So thank you all for attending. Bye.